I prepared this handout so you can follow along a bit. So it's really an honor to be here this evening because I so admired Joel Helander, the Guilford Town historian, and he's here this evening, and this is his wonderful book. And you can read a lot about Abraham Baldwin here. And I also am happy to follow in the footsteps of Tracy Tomaselli, who did so much to assemble information about the enslaved population in Guilford and, of course, East Guilford, where I live, which is now called Madison. So how does the son of a blacksmith and a farmer, born in a forgotten spot in North Guilford, grow up to be a signer of the Constitution and the founder of another institution, the University of Georgia? Well, now I'm going to tell you. Of course, you recognize that from Hamilton. My apologies to Lin-Manuel Miranda. But there were actually quite a few parallels I discovered between Abraham Baldwin and the much better known Alexander Hamilton. Both grew up in modest circumstances. Both their mothers died when they were young. Hamilton went on to study at King's College, which became Columbia. Baldwin went on to study at Yale. Baldwin was even challenged to a duel because of some remarks he made on the floor of Congress. Unlike Hamilton, he was able to avoid the consequences. He was more level-headed, I think. So, isn't it remarkable that one of the most important documents in world history, the United States Constitution, one of its drafters was born just a few miles away from here. And it's a document that we still argue about, but right there on Great Hill Road in North Guilford, you can see the monument. And of course, we also have here in Guilford the Abraham Baldwin School. And, but as the musical might suggest, you remember the line was, in New York, you can be a new man, talking about Hamilton's journey from St. Croix to New York. Well, Baldwin made the journey from Connecticut to Georgia. So even though he was born here in Guilford and lived in Guilford until age 14 and then moved to attend Yale, after Yale he eventually wound up in Georgia, and that's where he, that's the state he represented both in the Continental Congress, and then after the new nation was formed, he was in the House of Representatives and then in the Senate, and he died in 1807, still a senator from Georgia. So if you look at the chronology that I put together on page 1, you can see he was born on November 22nd in North Guilford, and people, historians have suggested that Connecticut was a slave state, but not a slave society. That is, in the South, the institution of slavery permeated everything. But as was earlier pointed out, slavery still existed in Connecticut until 1848. But right here in Guilford, there is a connection to slavery in the Baldwin family. And I've noted that here, and it was also on the slide just earlier. Just think about how awful this is, that Michael Baldwin, Abraham Baldwin's father, he bought a slave, an enslaved person, from Jonathan Lane in Middletown. You know, Middletown was the port where a lot of of the slaves came through from the Caribbean. New Englanders sold their horses and turnips and other vegetables to the plantation owners in the Caribbean because they didn't want to use their land for crops and other things. They just wanted to use it for sugar cane. And so a lot of New Englanders made a profit from the sale, even though there were comparatively few slaves in this neck of the woods. There was still this intertwining of the slave industry and the North. In any event, Jonathan Lane of Middletown sold Abraham Baldwin's father, Michael Baldwin, a man named Peleg, and Michael Baldwin sued Lane in the same way we might sue for a defective product or like a breach of warranty. To think of that a human being could be treated in that way as an object of a lawsuit. And it took a number of years, but as I note here in 1758, a jury in New Haven decided that Baldwin's claim was valid and Lane owed him 18 pounds plus costs for this unsound slave. It's horrible to contemplate. As I speak, I'm going to pass around a few items. This is hard to read, but it's a photo of the manuscript of the records of this case. And if people want, I can point out how to find this stuff. That's from the State Archives. So there's a record of this lawsuit and its result. So in 1769, the Baldwin family moved to New Haven in order to help Abraham attend Yale. And Abraham Baldwin graduated from Yale in 1772, but like many in his time, he studied for a divinity degree, and he became a minister, and he was licensed to preach in 1775 by the Association of Ministers locally, but he also became a tutor at Yale. So he spent a number of years there. But then in 1779, we're on the next page now, if you're following along, he resigned from Yale to serve as a chaplain during the Revolutionary War. And of course, Hamilton was also involved in the war, although Hamilton saw a lot more action. Baldwin was more behind the lines, visiting the troops. And after the war, Baldwin switched careers. So he studied the law. Back then, there were no formal law schools. And he was admitted to the bar in Fairfield County. But he didn't remain long in that profession. It's possible that he got the idea to move to Georgia from General Nathaniel Greene, who was one of the Revolutionary War most famous generals, a great strategist. And that's where Greene had a plantation after the war. So for whatever reason, Baldwin went to Georgia, he opened his law practice there, and almost immediately he was elected to the Georgia State Legislature. And what's probably the greatest feather in his cap is that he is sometimes regarded today as the father of higher education in this country, because he founded the first state university, the University of Georgia. And he believed in the importance of educating everyone in society. That, however, did not include people of African ancestry, and at that time it did not include women. So when he was in the Georgia legislature, he got his fellow legislators to vote for the charter to create this new institution. And that's pretty amazing because the population was rather thin in Georgia at the time. It was the remotest state. It was largely a wilderness. And to think ahead about higher education for the future was really a seminal idea. And that's the same year, 1785, that Baldwin was elected to the Continental Congress. So you see at the bottom of page 2, a first day cover. These are they're issued when a stamp comes out, and you can see the portrait of Abraham Baldwin. And notice the postmark, it's from Athens, Georgia. That's where the University of Georgia is. And so in 1985, on the anniversary of the founding of the school, this stamp was issued, and you can see Abraham Baldwin there. He's called founder of the American State University System and the University of Georgia. So that alone is extremely important. But as Paul Harvey, some of you know him, the radio host, used to say, and now for the rest of the story. So, we go to page 3 in our handout. And at the Constitutional Convention, one of the big issues was, would it be like under the Articles of Confederation, where each state has equal representation, or would representation in the new national legislature be based on population? And this was really a bone of contention, and many times the convention threatened to disband over this issue. And so Abraham Baldwin played a very critical role in, he actually voted contrary to the way he said he was going to vote. It came down to a committee, and in previous votes, the 2 representatives from Georgia were in support of representing the states on the basis of equal representation. But he decided to, despite his own feelings, exercise his vote on that occasion for the proportional representation based on population. And that was really important, because had he voted the other way, as he really felt, it would have all gone to pieces. So this was kind of a strategic vote in the hopes that people would continue to debate and discuss. So think of that, it comes down to one vote sometimes at this critical juncture. So Baldwin should be honored for that. And you can see that I've got in toward the bottom of page 3 there, Article 1, Section 2 from the Constitution, and that's where it says that representatives in the House shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers. So the House, of course, is based on population, and the Senate, as we know today, is based on equal representation from the states. And so he was instrumental in achieving that. But when you read on in that Article 1, Section 2, you see the reference, the veiled reference to slavery. So the numbers that are used to determine the population, as well as any direct taxes being apportioned, shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. That's the famous 3/5 clause, which doesn't use the word slave. but everyone knew that's what was being referred to. Now, some people were very much against this, and perhaps the most vocal, outspoken opponent of having this sort of sop thrown to slaveholders was the delegate from New York named Gouverneur Morris. So Gouverneur Morris gave what was perhaps the most famous anti-slavery speech at the Constitutional Convention. And we know this from James Madison's notes. He was the one who kept the record of this, what was going on, because it wasn't open to the public. So listen to what Gouverneur Morris said, and then we're going to turn to what Abraham Baldwin said. Gouverneur Morris said, he never would concur in upholding domestic slavery. It was a nefarious institution. It was the curse of heaven on the states where it prevailed. Upon what principle is it that the slaves shall be computed in the representation? Are they men? Then make them citizens and let them vote. Are they property? Why then is no other property included? The houses in this city, Philadelphia, are worth more than all the wretched slaves who cover the rice swamps of South Carolina. The admission of slaves into the representation, Gouverneur Morris went on, when fairly explained, comes to this, that the inhabitant of Georgia and South Carolina who goes to the coast of Africa and in defiance of the most sacred laws of humanity, tears away his fellow creatures from their dearest connections and damns them to the most cruel bondage, shall have more votes in a government instituted for protection of the rights of mankind than the citizen of Pennsylvania or New Jersey who views with a laudable horror so nefarious a practice. So that was the height of anti-slavery sentiment inside the Constitutional Convention. That was Gouverneur Morris on August 8th. So now, let's turn to the tepid response of Abraham Baldwin. So at the top of page 3, there's been broached the idea of banning the slave trade, not abolishing slavery domestically, but at least limiting the further importation of slaves from Africa. But Abraham Baldwin, representing Georgia, wants none of it. So at the top of page 3. And this is written in the third person because it's Madison's notes. Mr. Baldwin had conceived national objects alone to be before the convention, not such as like the present were of a local nature. So he's saying slavery is local, meaning states get to control that. Georgia was decided on this point. That state has always hitherto supposed a general government to be the pursuit of the central states who wish to have a vortex for everything, like Virginia, the powerful states with larger populations. That her distance, Georgia's distance, would preclude her from equal advantage, and that she could not prudently purchase it by yielding national powers to the new government. From this it might be understood in what light she, the state of Georgia, would view an attempt to abridge one of her favorite prerogatives. That's how Baldwin is referring to slavery, a favorite prerogative. If left to herself, she may probably put a stop to the evil. As one ground for this conjecture, he took notice of the sect of, now it's interesting, this, there's no word written in Madison's notes there. This was a convention sometimes to just leave blank for maybe filling in later, or what Madison was referring to and what Baldwin was referring to was the Quakers. So I'm going to talk about the Quakers in a moment. But Baldwin is saying, as one ground for this conjecture, he took notice of the sect of Quakers, which he said was a respectable class of people who carried their ethics beyond the mere equality of men extending their humanity to the claims of the whole animal creation. So he's saying, like some did at the time, slavery's gonna die out. Look, we have these groups coming forward. That's a good sign, but it is a local matter. It shouldn't be in the Constitution. Let the states handle it themselves. So I call this strike one against Baldwin. I'm gonna give you 3 moments when history kind of turned on a dime, and you wish more had been done right at this moment in the Constitutional Convention. But you see, Baldwin is in the forefront. He's not speaking like Gouverneur Morris did.
Could I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Was, cotton became king 30, 40, 50 years later. Was slavery as essential to the commerce in the South as it became in the earlier part of the 19th century? Already at this time, was it commercially essential?
It's definitely dominates the Georgia economy, but it only exponentially rose. And I'm glad you asked that, because that's gonna be our 3rd strike against Baldwin in a moment. But let me get to strike 2. But it's true, the soils in the eastern seaboard, they're being exhausted, you know, and that's one of the reasons people think slavery is dying out. But if you can go to fresh new territory with so far undepleted soil, and the cotton gin is invented in 1794. So things really take off. Slavery may have been thought to be dying out, and it moves south and west, as I'll explain. And Baldwin had, I'm arguing, a key role in all of this. But let's go to strike 2. So strike 2 is, if you turn to page 4, a few years later, but still very early, in the United States Congress, the very first Congress of the new national government, there's a petition filed by the Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery, February 3rd, 1790, and I quote the whole document. But basically it recognizes that people of the African race were fellow humans, and we should do something about it. And so we're asking you, the first Congress, to consider their humanity, that you will promote mercy and justice towards this distressed race, and that you will step to the very verge of the powers vested in you for discouraging every species of traffic in the persons of our fellow men. You know, the Quakers were really the first abolitionists in world history. And I don't mean to demean the agency, the actions that enslaved people themselves took to seek their own freedom. But among whites, the Quakers were really the first people to speak out. And an example of that was he had on a great coat, and under the coat was a sword, and he had a hollowed out book. And in that book, he had deposited red pokeberry juice. And you know what Quaker meetings are, right? They're silent until people are moved to speak. So he, at one point in the meeting, he stood up and he said, God will shed the blood of all slaveholders, because at that time, Quakers and many others held people in bondage. And he raised this book above his head, and he took out the sword and he stabbed the book, and this red liquid spattered the congregation, and it was like blood. And so that made an incredible impact on the audience, and it really was the way that many of these Quakers drove home the terrible immorality, contrary to God's word, of slavery. Yes.
As a Quaker myself, I have to say there is unfortunately another side to the story. On the western shore of Maryland, there's a cemetery with no meeting house, and if those of you who know Easton, there's a very old meeting house, Quaker meeting house that George Fox visited. And I lived in Annapolis, and I discovered that when, I guess it was in 1757, when slaveholding was considered incompatible with the faith and practice, the Quakers on the Western Shore joined the Anglican Church rather than give up their slaves. So, you're painting a wonderful picture of our faith.
Well, it did take a long time for these ideas to sink in, but they were first voiced largely by Quakers, others like John Woolman, Anthony Benezet, often around Philadelphia. In any event, the Quakers submitted this petition, and what did our friend Abraham Baldwin have to say? So that's on page 5 of the handout. Mr. Baldwin was sorry the subject had ever been brought up because it was of a delicate nature as it respected some of the states. Gentlemen who had been present at the formation of the Constitution could not avoid the recollection of the pain and difficulty which the subject caused in that body. The members from the southern states were so tender upon this point that they had well nigh broken up without coming to any determination. However, from the extreme desire of preserving the Union and obtaining an efficient government, they were induced mutually to concede, and the Constitution jealously guarded what they agreed to. If gentlemen look over the footsteps of that body, they will find the greatest degree of caution used to imprint them, so as not to be easily eradicated. But the moment we go to jostle on that ground, I fear we shall feel it tremble under our feet. Congress have no power to interfere with the importation of slaves beyond what is given in the 9th section of the 1st article of the Constitution. Everything else is interdicted to them in the strongest terms. If we examine the Constitution, we shall find the expressions relative to this subject cautiously expressed and more punctiliously guarded than any other part. The migration, he's quoting now, and I set forth those articles on an earlier page. The migration or importation of such persons shall not be prohibited by Congress. But lest this should not have secured the object sufficiently, it is declared in the same section that no capitation or direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census. This was intended to prevent Congress from laying any special tax upon Negro slaves, as they might in this way so burden the possessors of them as to induce a general emancipation. If we go on to the 5th article, we shall find the 1st and 5th clauses of the 9th section of the 1st article restrained from being altered before the year 1808. Gentlemen have said that this petition from the Quakers does not pray for an abolition of the slave trade. And that's true. You know, it mentioned step to the very verge of the powers, but they recognized, but there were plenty of other things that Congress could have done. It could have regulated the conditions on slave ships. It could have addressed domestic slavery. It could have required different measures, a national law to make it easier to manumit slaves. You know, some of the states were preventing even people who wanted to free the enslaved in their wills. They were saying, well, that's not enough. You have to get the legislature of the state to approve what you want to have carried out in your will. So the national legislature might well have come up with many different proposals short of what they couldn't do, abolish the slave trade before 1808. But Baldwin is treating it like none of this should be brought up. And he says, gentlemen have said that this petition from the Quakers does not pray for an abolition of the slave trade. I think, sir, it prays for nothing else. And therefore we have no more to do with it of addressing the institution of slavery. And our man, Abraham Baldwin, is part of that, unfortunately. So now on to strike 3 on page 6, and this gets into the question earlier. So you look at the map there, Georgia, like many states, or former colonies, had claims to land well beyond its borders. When these various areas of the Atlantic seaboard were first settled, people would come sometimes with a charter from the King of England. Connecticut's is interesting in itself. The Royal Charter of 1662 described the boundaries of Connecticut as extending westward to the South Sea. You know how Connecticut has kind of a rectangular shape? And if you, instead of having the north-south line at the western border, imagine it went all the way west through Salt Lake City, hitting the Pacific. That's technically what the description was in that charter. You may know Case Western Reserve. I know there's at least one graduate from there. You know, that's the Western Reserve because Connecticut reserved part of its territory when it ceded its lands to the new government, and that Cleveland was in that long rectangular strip. So I'm just saying that there are plenty of states that had Western lands that they were arguing about what should happen to them under the new Constitution. So Georgia also had a massive, millions of acres under its royal charters, and you can see this now in the map. So when Abraham Baldwin got down there, you can see those few counties that are settled in the upper right. But the territory of Georgia at that point, this map is from 1796, extended all the way to the Mississippi River. And you can also see on the map how there are lots of indigenous nations still occupying this territory. The Chickasaws, the Cherokees, the Choctaws, the Creeks, and the Seminoles. These were later known as the 5 civilized tribes, because civilized, ironically, because they adopted the ways of European settlers, like agriculture, and but that wasn't enough to prevent them from being forced out of the territories that they had occupied for thousands of years, and this eventuated in the Trail of Tears, and these tribes wound up in Oklahoma, present-day Oklahoma. That's a later event, but Georgia had this territory, and 1802, they cede the territory. They finally give up their western lands. Other states had done so before, to the national government, to the new United States. And Abraham Baldwin was one of the 3 negotiators representing the state of Georgia. On the other side were 3 negotiators, commissioners from the national government, and one of them was James Madison. And this was during the Jefferson administration, and Madison, of course, was one of the people at the Constitutional Convention, later became president, but at this point, he's working in the Jefferson administration. I have actually an original copy here, which I'll pass around, of the message issued by President Jefferson to announce that this deal had been struck between Georgia and the United States. And you can see on a page I have open on the back, you can see Abraham Baldwin's name. So I'll pass this around. But what does this have to do with our story? Well, the model for granting this western territory of Georgia to the United States government and making it available to create new states was the Northwest Territory, which was the Northwest Ordinance from 1787, the territory to the north of the Ohio River. Originally, states like Virginia and others had claims to it, New York. And so the states of Michigan and Minnesota and Wisconsin and others came out of that Northwest Territory. But the Northwest Ordinance provided that there was to be no slavery north of the Ohio River in that territory. And that's why Dred Scott was able to sue, because he claimed that the slaveholder had brought him to free territory, to a military facility in the Wisconsin territory, and once free, always free was the argument. And originally, Dred Scott won in the lower courts in Missouri, but we all know how the United States Supreme Court held that African Americans could not become citizens, could not sue in federal court, and just because he resided in a free territory, that didn't make him free. But at least for many people, it was really significant that even before the Constitution was adopted and the new nation was established, the Continental Congress had passed the Northwest Ordinance, which banned slavery from a large chunk of the North American continent. Well, Baldwin and his friend Thomas Jefferson, they corresponded a lot. They, I believe, knew full well what they were up to. And you can read the words on the back of that document I'm passing around, but basically, this new agreement ceding the Georgia Territory said that it followed the wording of the Northwest Ordinance, quote, that article only accepted which forbids slavery. So in other words, the fateful decision was made to permit slavery to depart from the precedent of the Northwest Territory and allow slavery to exist in the new territory, and that became the states of Alabama and Mississippi. And in combination with the new technology of the cotton gin, settlers moved west, and pretty soon that became the new stronghold of the slave power. Imagine if slavery had been barred from that Western territory. Imagine if Baldwin and his fellow negotiators hadn't come up with that. So that is strike three. There was a further stain on American history represented by this episode, because these tribes were later displaced. No one cared about them. In fact, there had been the Treaty of New York in 1790 with the federal government, which had actually given some protections to Native Americans occupying the Southeast. But this arrangement under the 1802 deal actually provided that the federal government will assist in removing Indians from this new territory to enable white settlers to occupy it. So Baldwin had a role also in this other problematic aspect of American history. You know the Shakespearean expression, I think it's from Julius Caesar, the good that, no, the evil that men do lives after them. The good often lies interred with their bones. Well, I have a little variation now on that. So fast forward to 2014. It's not Abraham Baldwin's bones we're talking about now, but there's a building at the University of Georgia called Baldwin Hall. In fact, there's a statue of Abraham Baldwin on the campus of the University of Georgia. And there's also the Abraham Baldwin Agricultural College as part of the Georgia state system. So there's this Baldwin Hall, and they're building an expansion, another wing. And the workers discover lots of bones. And people in the African American community, they know immediately whose bones they are. They are the bones of enslaved people who worked at the college, and they're the kind of people whose remains would be disposed of in a more cavalier way instead of the nice marked cemetery for whites down the road. So these bones are discovered, and so this is all you can read more about this whole episode on the last page of my handout. It's called Slavery at UGA, at the University of Georgia. This is an article from 2021, but it recaps a lot of what I'm explaining now. So these bones are discovered, and people in the African American community, they want the bones interred, and they want a monument. They want people to be buried at the black cemetery and be treated with some dignity. And, well, basically, kind of like the East Wing of the White House was just torn down unceremoniously. It's a really poignant scene where one of the members of the local community is looking through a chain link fence, barred from this site, this construction site. These bones are dug up and they are deposited in the white cemetery without any kind of recognition. So this created quite a stir, a diplomatic problem for the University of Georgia. So today, there's actually a monument that acknowledges the existence of these enslaved people, and they have been moved, and there was a ceremony rededicating their remains. But even today, the University of Georgia doesn't really say that these people were enslaved at the University of Georgia. All the monument says is, we honor the African Americans who lived here. In other words, they didn't really want to say what happened. There's just this denial, and let's just let it disappear. So you can read all about that in this last page of my handout. But in the lower left, I just wanted you to see the reference to Abraham Baldwin, because this incident with the bones at the University of Georgia, it led to a symposium on slavery at the university, and of course many schools have re-examined their connection with slavery since. So University of Georgia finally was led to do something. But in the lower left corner of this page, if you can read the small print, it says, after listing a number of people who owned slaves, including presidents of the University of Georgia, professors and others, it says, UGA also supplied intellectual support for slavery. The university's founder, Abraham Baldwin, was a prominent national defender of slavery, though he apparently owned none himself. I think that sums up this whole story well, that he, in the way he spoke on these three critical occasions at the Constitutional Convention, in the first Congress, when Congress had a chance to do something about the anti-slavery petition from the Quakers, And then in the negotiation about how to dispose of the Georgia territory in 1802, when he helped ensure that slavery could persist. Those are three moments when he could have done something else, and he didn't. So that's Abraham Baldwin, slavery, and the Constitution. So I'm happy to hear your comments or take some questions. Thank you. Start with Joel. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is riveting. I don't know whether to say your remarks are enlightening but troubling, or troubling but enlightening.
I'll take it.
I never took a deep dive into Baldwin's view on slavery, but despite the three strikes, can't we really give Baldwin credit for saving the United States, which otherwise would have been disunited?
Without a doubt.
Had it
yes.
not been for his vote,
Without a doubt.
a strategic vote, which I don't think anybody else would have done.
I agree with you. And
The only
yet,
other thing I wanted to say
it's part
was-
and parcel. You can't really separate the slavery issue from the representation issue.
Yeah.
You know, Thomas Jefferson, of course, his reputation has undergone some changes in recent years as people have recognized that he fathered slaves, 6 of them, 6 children with Sally Hemings. And yet we can still honor Jefferson for drafting the Declaration of Independence, but a full picture of history includes the dark side. And so that's what I'm trying to do.
Thank you for redeeming him. One other comment I wanted to make, in 2004, on the 250th anniversary of Baldwin's birth, as you know, we had a school-wide celebration at the Abraham Baldwin School, and we dedicated the monument. My deep dive probably was not as deep as yours into slavery. I never touched it because the biographies don't really go into
Right.
it. And there's only been 2 biographies. But at that celebration, a large part of it, which was not in the school, but on Great Hill Road where the monument is, an historian from the University of Georgia came up to Guilford. And that,
Well,
for
you know,
me, was very significant.
I read the newspaper account of that event, and I can't quote it exactly, maybe you remember, but I really liked your words on that occasion, because you can imagine the group assembled up there at Great Hill Road, and you said something like, look around, look out into this pasture, it's like the Swiss Alps up here. Think about that young boy and doing chores and learning. You know, he developed a great character from that experience. So, you know, that was it's a wonderful monument, and that's what actually piqued my interest in this subject. But it really wasn't the fashion, even a few decades ago, even with Thomas Jefferson, to focus on these issues of slavery as we do today. And so many groups like Witness to History, the Slavery Project here in Guilford, and Witness Stones, and you know, we really have a greater, at least some of us have a greater appreciation for these aspects of history that some people would want to suppress. Yeah.
So, as a child therapist, one of the things you look at is development. And one of the things you have to do as a child growing up is to realize that you're a mixture of good and bad. So when you fall, you know, you're not just a klutz, because sometimes you really run well, but sometimes you fall. And I think, you know, we as a nation are in the process of developing the sense of ourselves as a mix of good and bad. We've done good things and we've done some bad things. And it's part of being human.
Yeah.
You know, I think I should mention that the slavery in Virginia was uneconomical, that
Right.
the Randolphs, who were the cousins of Thomas Jefferson, sold off their slaves and hired free labor and made much more money.
Right, and this Georgia territory was a place, let me just tell you one incident about Thomas Jefferson. He had a nail factory on the premises of Monticello. And in this nail factory, he employed 12-year-old boys, African-American boys, to work to hammer nails out of long rods of iron. And one of the boys, actually, you can imagine all the pressure and the stress of being a child and being forced to labor 12 hours a day. One of these boys wound up killing another. And the author of the Declaration of Independence told the overseer, get rid of him. I don't care if you sell him into slavery somewhere, just get him out of Monticello, out of Virginia. I never want to hear about this boy again. So that would be another example. And Jefferson, of course, fell into debt, never made money with the nail factory or anything else. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much for this. This is
Yeah.
a really interesting topic. I grew up in Guilford. I went to Baldwin Middle School, and growing up, we weren't taught about enslaved people and slavery. We weren't taught about Abraham Baldwin in this respect. And now we have this history that we can teach the next generations and let them think on different levels, both sides.
Yes.
Well, like that, I'm a relative newcomer to Connecticut. I was born in Wisconsin and grew up outside of Philadelphia. So that's where I sort of learned, and then I went to university, but in Canada. So my exposure to US history and it was, limited to those years. And when I now came a couple of years ago to here, to Guilford, and discovered that there was a slave auction here, it's like, what? Because, even in Philadelphia, that was, I've never looked into it, but you don't spend a lot of time studying those aspects of that part of the colonial experience, so thank you.
Yes. This gentleman's comment about human behavior and development over time leads me to wonder whether Baldwin was himself convinced about the value, commercial value or whatever, of slavery, or was he representing the people who...
I have the exact same question.
Yeah.
And it leads one to wonder, what is the proper role of a representative? Is it to do what's right, or to do what your constituents think,
Right.
what they want? But his language, he never even acknowledged that maybe we should look into the slavery conditions. He was so dismissive. I mean, he was actually a very effective representative of the Georgians. Oh, here's the front page of the the Augusta Chronicle and Gazette of the State for May 9th, May 8th, 1790. It's covering one of his speeches on the floor of Congress when he was very dismissive of Quakers. But Baldwin is getting front page coverage, his entire speech, all of this pro-slavery sentiment, and I think this sealed his reputation among his constituents. At the very least, he never uttered a word like Gouverneur Morris or others did when he might have.
Maybe if elementary education in Guilford had been a little better in those days.
Or Yale, right?
Or Yale.
That's right. Shucks.
Yeah, Tracy.
Well, his father being an enslaver, and then Nathaniel Greene was an enslaver, and moved.
I'm sorry, who did you say?
Nathaniel Greene was also
Yes,
an
yes, yes,
enslaver, so
right.
his role
Right,
models.
and as we
other
know, all the
figures.
ministers around here
Yes.
had slaves. You can still see in the North Guilford Cemetery, Simeon Chittenden, and right next door is Shem.
Yeah, and to add to that, certainly Baldwin, you say he moved away, went into New Haven at age 14 to attend Yale. He grew up in a community, North Guilford, that was rife with slaveholders.
Right?
And I just looked quickly at Talcott's genealogy before we came here. His classmates, for his grammar school education, the common school education
Right.
in North Guilford, all had parents who were slaveholders. particularly the Scrantons, Ebenezer Scranton.
Yes,
And that house was moved to get down to Guilford.
and up there by Lake Quanticook
So
today.
all of his friends, and he must have been in households where
You
there
didn't
were
think
slaves,
anything of it.
and had been exposed to the
Yeah.
dehumanizing aspects of slavery.
Right.
So what influence did North Guilford have on the board?
Unfortunately, reluctantly, I think we have to suggest it at least made it not seem as bad as it seems to others, even then or now.
To broaden the view, if you go to our website, slaveryinguilford.org, you'll see recordings of past talks we've had. Professor Forbes gave a talk, and in it, he talked about slavery in Connecticut, and he talked about the Long Island Sound, and he called it the New England Mediterranean. And there were 16 navigatable rivers, he noted, and these rivers allowed ships to go far inland. So Derby and further north, you mentioned Middletown, that he was born in Middletown. Middletown was a port. The Connecticut River goes all the way up through Massachusetts and beyond. So the trade with the Caribbean was part and parcel of this, and the head of the Middlesex Historical Society told me 100,000 horses went from Connecticut to the Caribbean.
Right, to turn the mill stones and the sugar mills, yes.
And Professor Forbes' talk is on our website, as this talk will be. You
Oh,
can,
thank you.
www.slaveryinguilford.org, shameless promotion, but I think it's a resource.
Well, thank you for listening.